Yeah. All right. And we should be live.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Matt Danner with Monolith Forensics. I see we've got I can see our attendees list here growing. We got about 40 people in so far. So I'll give it just a minute to make sure everybody hops in and see if give everybody a chance to make sure they're in and they can hear us. Um, we do have the chat open. Cool. Awesome. All right, cool. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. This is our first sort of workshop Wednesdays. This is a webinar series that we're going to run every 2 weeks on Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. Central Time. So what I'm going to try to do over the next year, we're going to run these. Some of them are going to be just me talking about stuff, but I'm going to really try to find some guest speakers as well, so we can bring in people from the industry to talk about different things. I've got two or three folks already lined up, which are going to be pretty cool. I've got um, an attorney that I've worked for years as a consultant, a digital forensics expert that I'll bring on some point this year to talk about litigation strategy and how lawyers like to use experts and his experience working with someone like me and other digital physics experts. We had some folks in the industry to come on and talk about things like encryption and digital cloud storage for forensic labs and um, folks to come on and talk about a lot of different stuff. So I think over the next year we're gonna have some pretty cool, pretty interesting presentations by people that we know here in the States in the industry. So if anybody else wants to, at some point in the year, if you have something really interesting you'd like to talk about and share with folks, just reach out to me or Megan, and just tell us about something you'd like to talk about, and we'll be happy to consider it and just bring you on to do a presentation if you'd like. The point of these is to just to create a webinar series that we can just share interesting things that we've all learned and share it with the community and just provide a space to talk about this interesting stuff and just share stuff that we're learning and gaining. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about reporting and documentation. So this is something I talk about over the years when I do presentations. I talk about, I have a fairly strong opinions on reporting and documentation and how they should be done. And I've seen just over the years with working with our customers at Monolith, Monolith has a case reporting system built into it that a lot of our customers make heavy use of. And I find when I talk to our customers, whether it's during a demo when we're trying to sell Monolith to someone or if we're training someone on how to use Monolith, I end up spending a lot of time just explaining our opinions on what a forensic report should be and what its purpose is and kind of what kind of content and how it should be organized and structured. And then because Monolith has a note-taking system built in, we also do a lot of talking about how you should think about documentation, how you should think about documenting your analysis. What constitutes, good documentation, what constitutes when you should document something, when you shouldn't. So I figured this would be a good first webinar series where we could talk about this out in the open, get it recorded, let you guys participate in the Q&A at the end, and then have this recording available for anybody else that wants to watch it, later or asynchronously after we've done it. So having said that, I'm going to get started in the presentation at the end. I'm going to go for about 30 to 45 minutes. And at the end, we're going to open the floor for Q&A. So if you guys have questions, just think about them, write them down as we're going through, and we're going to open the floor at the end so that you guys can actually come on live and ask your questions, and then we'll talk about it, and I'll try to give my best answer as I can. Okay, so let's get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and there is some stuff I'm going to share at the end. So if you pay attention to chat, I'm going to drop some of these materials I'm going to reference into the chat so that you guys can have them for your own reference and needs. I'm going to start by just, for these presentations, every week that I do them, I'm going to write up my basic notes about the presentation, the stuff that I put together to prepare to talk. And then I'm just going to share them with you guys so that you have them. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. So hopefully you guys can see this. These are my notes for today's presentation. And basically what we have here is, and this kind of ties into a little bit of my talk on documentation, but basically this is my code editor that we use here at Monolith for actually writing code for Monolith. And I'm just using it to just basically document my notes for this presentation inside of a Markdown editor. And this is one of the documents I'm going to share in this presentation so you guys have a copy of it. But basically, I think the big theme of this talk really about documentation and reporting is just that, documentation is not the same as reporting. These are two different things. And sometimes what I see with a lot of, not just our customers, but folks that I meet out and about, folks that I've met throughout my career as a forensic analyst, I've noticed sometimes these two things get a little blurred. So I've been able to just summarize, in my opinion, what the difference is between these two things. So documentation is for the experts. So documentation is stuff for me and you and people actually doing the work. Reporting is for everybody else. So what that means is that what you document for yourself, to document the work you're doing and to document your analysis, document how you're doing your analysis, all that stuff, that's great. That's for your own use case. That's for you to be able to reflect back on, to remember how you did something or what specifically you did. But the way that you report on your findings and your analysis, that is for the triers of fact. That's for the people that are going to ingest the analysis that you did. So what you document is not necessarily going to be the same as what you report. So that's kind of the overall theme here to take away from this presentation is to start thinking differently about what your documentation is versus what your reporting is. So before we fully hop into this, just to give, for those of you that don't know me, I know there's a lot of folks here that know me and know my background, but my background before running Monolith, I was a forensic analyst and digital forensics expert for over 10 years. I still am. I still get hired here in Austin, Texas, locally by some law firms that like to use me. So I still do a little bit of consulting work from time to time, but the vast majority of my work today is now running Monolith. But for over a decade, I was a digital forensics expert where I got to work, I had a fairly fortunate career where I got to work on a lot of different cases and case types, including everything from typical law enforcement, criminal casework, all the way through, cybersecurity consultations where, I'm on a team working on large data breaches and things like that. I've testified, I don't know, probably three plus dozen times in court in various trials, depositions, hearings all over the country. And I've worked on just tons of cases. I've probably written, I don't know, maybe 1,000 forensic reports in my career. So that's the experience that I'm drawing upon for presentations like this, is just that background. And the first thing that I'll tell you also is that I am by no means like a perfect report writer. None of us are. I've definitely written my fair share of bad forensic reports. I can go back to years past, and I've seen some of the forensic reports I've written, from 10 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. And frankly, sometimes I cringe when I read my old forensic reports because there's some reports I just wrote early in my career that I really hadn't honed in on the process and really hadn't put a lot of, thought into what the purpose of a report is and what makes an effective forensic report. So having said that, this is me being humble and saying, I'm basically just telling you, here are the things that I figured out from my previous failures, from my previous experience of looking at my own bad forensic reports and what I don't like about them now when I review them. So let's get to the basics here. What's the purpose of a forensic report? So the ultimate purpose of something like a forensics report, especially in digital forensics, we're just trying to clearly communicate our findings in an objective manner to people that can rely on our expertise to make decisions. If you are in law enforcement, typically they're using your forensic report, to aid in the prosecution of someone. They're looking for evidence that helps them prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime in court. If you are in the private sector, if you're working for litigators in civil litigation, they're using your report to determine if there's a preponderance of evidence to prove a claim or help disprove a claim, right? If you're not in a litigation setting, maybe you're just doing maybe you're an internal analyst that you help with HR investigations, or you're just helping with any type of internal analysis that may be needed. The leadership in your organization is relying on your expertise to provide, clear findings that they can take action on, whatever that action is. Right. So the purpose of the report is just to take your expertise, take your analysis, and distill it into something actionable, something that a non-expert can use. If it doesn't do that, then your report is basically pointless. There's no reason to even bother writing it. So a couple of notes that I have here, you want to distill the work that we do as experts. It's complicated work. We spend years, countless hours training, years of experience. We've done thousands of these examinations to build our expertise. And so the report is basically our way of providing other people that didn't take that time, that don't have that experience, to understand what the result is of our analysis. So we're going to distill some complicated analysis into something non-experts can consume easily. I like to think of this, because I'm also an engineer on top of an analyst, I like to think of our forensic reports as sort of an API for our expertise. So if you're familiar with what an API is just an interface that allows systems or programmers to use other abstracted, complicated pieces of code. And in this case, what we're doing is we are taking our expertise as a forensic analyst or digital forensics expert, and we are creating an API that serves as an interface for our expertise. So what that means is you have, let's say a prosecutor comes to you, they say, here's a computer, I want you to do some analysis. They don't necessarily care how you did the analysis. They don't necessarily care, what you did in the 6 hours that you spent looking at the computer data. They want to give you a computer, and what they want back is a result that they can understand, right? Here's a computer. I need to know if bad things happened on this. And what they want is a report that tells them whether those bad things happen or not. They don't necessarily care about the specifics of why, or the specifics of how it happened. They don't necessarily care about how you figured out it happened, at least not at this point, right? Eventually that stuff will become important, but at the point of reporting and forensic reporting, what they're looking for is simply they want to give you something, and what they want back is a set of results that they can take action on. Okay. So when doing your reporting, thinking about who your audience is really important. For those of us that have worked in a myriad of different types of cases and environments, doing forensic analysis in a criminal case for a prosecutor is a little bit different than doing a forensic analysis in a civil case for a litigator. The standard of evidence is different. The type of strategy that a litigator is using is going to be quite different from a prosecutor. So depending on what that environment is, what that context is, your report could be a little bit different, right? Like I found that in civil cases, my findings and reports tend to be a lot more complex, a lot more complicated and technical, because in civil cases, sometimes really small and minute things matter, and it gives the litigator a lot of things to make arguments around. In criminal cases, a lot of times the crime is fairly black and white, so the evidence either has to show something happened or show that it didn't. It's pretty clear in a lot of those cases. In civil litigation, there's a lot more room for argument, a lot more room for interpretation. So the analysis can sometimes be a little bit more complex. But this is important to think about who you're reporting to, like who is your report going to be consumed by, who is it going to, and this can kind of add to the strategy of how you structure the report, add to the strategy of what specific things you might find are important to report on. For example, if you're doing something for a regulatory body, there could be certain specific standards that your report has to include. If you're working or writing a forensic report for an agency that you work for, they may have certain standards for all of their reports agency-wide that they have to include. So there's things like I know some of our customers will generate a report in Monolith, and then they'll add, because their agency just has an agency-wide disclaimer on all their documents that they add. So they have to go into the report and add a paragraph somewhere that just has this common legal disclaimer. So there's things like that you have to kind of think about when you're thinking about who is this audience that you're reporting to. So typically, I'm in reports, like you want to tailor the complexity and language to the audience. So What this typically means is like think about who you're reporting to and thinking about how technical the report should be. My general opinion on reports is that they shouldn't be as, they're probably not, they don't need to be as technical as you think they need to be. But if you know that, for example, if you're in a context where I know I've been in certain civil cases where when I've written a report, I made it more technical than it needed to be because I knew there was another expert on the case. And I knew that I wanted to really drive home some of the technical aspects so that that other expert would be able to clearly see, basically the evidence that I had. I wanted to make it very clear to that expert, here's the evidence I have, and here's how I know it's here. And here are the specific details that tell me this evidence is what it is, because I really didn't want it to be ambiguous at all. But if I'm writing a report that I know there is no other expert in the case, there is no other expert to review it, I may like pull back on the complexity a little bit and just simplify the report and keep it on its basic details. Because I know I'm always going to have my documentation. If another expert comes along and they want more details, I have my documentation for that. I have documentation on the specific details of how I did my analysis. So I always have that to write another report or a supplemental that adds that complexity that the other expert may need. So signs of a bad forensic report. So this is from both my own reports that I've looked at in the past and also from other forensic reports I've seen, and frankly, also other presentations I've seen by other folks in the fields on writing reports. I'll just go through some of these really quick. This is a big pet peeve of mine when I read other people's reports. I've seen some forensic reports that are 10 pages long, and a third of the report is used just to describe the hashing process of forensic images and the verification of images that they received or created. And this is completely pointless. Nobody cares about this in your report. Nobody cares about how good you are at verifying hash values. Like, it just doesn't matter. This only matters if there's a problem with the image. The expert's not going to care. I mean, if the other expert does care about this, I would say they're being pedantic and just wasting their time. But the only time anybody's going to actually care or this is going to matter is if I get a copy of a forensic image and it has an FTK image or log or something, and that log has the hash values, or the EO1 image has the embedded hash values. I'm only going to care about this if I can't verify the image myself, right? If I get a copy of a forensic image and I just do a quick verification before I start the analysis, if those hashes fail to match, that's when this stuff is going to become important. But it's not going to be important in the report. Okay, if I have a problem with the verifying the hashes, I'm going to contact you as the other expert, and we're going to figure it out together. I'm not going to reference your report for this. So don't waste time on this piece, in my opinion. I would say just leave this in your documentation. And in fact, most tools now, they're self-documenting on this stuff. Most forensic tools that create forensic images, they have their own logging. And those logs, from my experience, and most tools are actually pretty good, where they log this stuff. So it's already self-documented. It's already there. Just make sure you're maintaining a copy of all the forensic logs that you have. And that's enough to be able to reverse engineer how you created an image and the hashes that were generated at the time of imaging. But this is one of those things that I've seen other reports spend the first 2 or 3 pages of the report just talk about this stuff, and you're just losing the effectiveness of your reporting. It's just kind of killing your ability to illustrate the findings that are actually important in your analysis. Another one, this also happens I see this in a lot of expert testimony as well, not just reporting. But if you're talking about the forensic tools that you use a lot, you're really hurting yourself in the report. This is another one of those things where nobody cares about the forensic. I know this is going to be a hot take by me, some people might think, but really nobody cares about the forensic tools that you used. It's okay to have a section of the report where you just generally list, here are the forensic tools generally used in this case or whatever. That's fine. Just to give everybody a general context of the types of tools that you use, but that's really still just for other experts. Sometimes attorneys or prosecutors or defense attorneys may care. They may want to know that you use standard tools, and they may be generally aware of tools like Celebrite or Magnet. But generally, again, this is something that can be in your documentation. But if you want to listen to the report, I think it's fine. But my point is, when you're going through your narrative and you're walking through your analysis, you should really not be mentioning the specifics of your forensic tools too often. Because the problem with this too is if you think about it, if you're writing up your analysis in your report and every other sentence you're saying celebrate this, celebrate that, axiom this, axiom that, X weighs this, X weighs that, what you're actually doing is you're creating a context through which your expertise is based on a tool and not actual expertise. You're just simply reporting that you loaded some data into some software and the software showed you stuff, and you're just regurgitating what that software showed you. It's giving an impression that you don't have fundamental expertise. It's just saying that you're more of a technician that knows how to click some buttons in a forensic tool. And it also demonstrates that you may not have the capacity to explain the forensics outside the context of your forensic tools. So this is something that I've looked for in both testimony and reporting when I'm dealing with an opposing expert, is I look to see how, when they're talking about forensics, how often do they have to reference their forensic tools in order to explain a concept or in order to explain a finding. That to me is a sign that they may not have a strong grasp of the fundamentals in forensics, the fundamentals of the data that they're working with, or the fundamentals of the artifacts they're referencing. Doesn't always mean that. It could just be the reporting style, but to me, it's just a strong sign that they may lack some of the fundamental understanding of digital forensics and the data that we come and look at in forensics. Discussion of imaging process. This goes same with hashes. You don't need to, in the report, you just simply don't need to talk about the imaging process. You really don't. At this point in the industry, forensic imaging and extraction is fairly standardized. We're all using the same tools. We're all using exactly the same techniques. Most of the tools we're using are self-documenting through logs anyway. And then also you can simply document this part in your notes or your documentation. So wasting time in the report explaining this is just a waste of time. It's a waste of space, waste of time. It's just padding your report with noise that, again, think about it. When the prosecutor reads your report, they don't care about this part. They don't care about this process. They only care about it when somebody else in the case brings it up as an issue, in which case your documentation and logging will support the process that you used. Another sign of a bad report basically is just a lack of editing in the report. So these 4 bullet items here are basically just, if you have a report where you have no headers or headings or titles or sections, very little white space, that makes for, not only is it a difficult report to read, but it basically indicates that you put very little effort into the report itself. I've seen reports before where it seems like it's just a waterfall of text in a Word document, where it's more like a stream of consciousness type of report than it is an actual forensic analysis report. So, I mean, just these 4 things alone, if you just start doing these in your reports are automatically, I would say, 10x better. If you don't have this stuff now and you add these to your reports, this will automatically just improve the quality of reports, like instantly. Because what these things do, white space, titles and headers, executive summaries, report sections, it just makes the report easier to read. The whole point of the report is to give it to somebody who can read it and quickly and easily understand what it is that you're trying to report to them. If you add sections and titles, it allows the reader to quickly scan through the report and see each section and pick and choose which sections they want to focus on. If you use spacing and white space, it allows the reader, it's easier on their eyes. It makes it easier for them to jump from one paragraph to the next very quickly and easily. It allows them to take breaks. It allows them to mark and bookmark sections of the report so that they can pause and come back to it. The executive summary makes it easier for them to understand within a few minutes what the report is about. And then just generally, report sections and headers and titles go hand in hand. They're pretty much the same thing, but report sections allows the reader to just split it up into sections to digest. The longer, this is sort of an art and the science, but the longer your report is, the more likely it is that you're going to need a table of contents. So don't be afraid to, if you have a very long report, I would say longer than 5 pages, you should probably have a table of contents that helps the user navigate the content of the report. Without that table of contents, it's just going to be very frustrating for the reader to navigate the report and use it. If you're using Word, you can use the TOC system in Word, or you can just create a table of contents on your own. The point is like, if you have a longer report, help out the reader, give them something that they can use to navigate the report with so they understand the structure and makeup of your report. If you spend a lot of time talking about standards and procedures in your report, this is another thing where I mean, maybe your organization has a policy on including this stuff, but I would say if you really want to reference these, reference them as an external reference in the report, or attach them as an exhibit or an attachment to the report, so that it doesn't get in the way of the reader getting what they need. Because the point is the report is for them to be able to quickly digest what your findings are. What is it that you're trying to convey to the reader that they need to know from this report? The more stuff like this that you add in, the harder you're making it for the report to do its job, which is to simply report the evidence, the information that that person, that litigator or prosecutor needs to do their job and to take action on your report. This is another thing too, where if you make your reports really long and you have a bunch of stuff like this in it, you have a bunch of stuff about your standards and procedures, you have a bunch of talk about hashes, you have a bunch of talk about your forensic process, you don't shut up about the forensic tools that you have. You're also going to make it to where the prosecutor or the litigator just may not value your report. They may read it and then just toss it in a drawer and not ingest it, because it takes too much work for them to even look through. Another one, which I think people have moved away from this, but a lot of forensic tools nowadays, and this has been true for years, but they all export some kind of forensic report or tool report or something of that nature. And this is where that report export is not your forensic report. This is the point that I'm making, is that if you export something like a UFED reader report or some kind of portable case or some kind of data set from your forensic tool, whatever your tool of choice is, that is not your forensic report. That's just an exhibit. That's just an attachment that should go with the report. Even if you don't necessarily have to write a report for everything you do, but when comes time to actually do a report or write a report, you don't want to just export something out of your forensic tool and call that your report, because that's not good enough. And this is where there's this quote here called "Context is worth 80 IQ points." This is a quote that I pulled from one of my employees, Andrew, and I actually looked it up, and it's associated with a computer scientist called Alan Kay. Basically, look this up. It's really important. This is really applicable to documentation reporting. Context is worth 80 IQ points. When you do a report export from your forensic tool, it has almost no context. The reader, the point of doing this is you're usually giving it to a non-forensic person, and they're not going to know what most of this stuff is. They're not going to know how to ingest it. They're not going to know how to read it. The purpose of your forensic report is to help them review stuff like this so that they have the context, because you've looked at it and you can tell them what data in this export is actually important. So quickly here, we'll go through the different types of reporting styles. And then what we're going to do is jump into an example report structure that you guys can consider using. So when I'm talking about report styles, what I'm really talking about is the narrative portion of the report. So there's a couple schools of thought here. Everybody does it differently. I don't think there's any one more or less successful pathway here. I think I've had people that I've worked with that try to impose a specific style of reporting on everybody else. I think that's wrong. I think there is, depending on the case, some cases, it makes a lot of sense to do a chronological style narrative. Right? Depending on the case and the context of the case, chronological works very, very well for certain cases where you literally just outline the facts and the analysis in a chronological order, where you're just stating things as they happened forensically. There's also what I call story-based, which is where not necessarily chronological, but it's more the style of the narrative is you're telling some kind of story, where instead of just sticking to the hard, cold forensic analysis, you are providing some investigative context to what your analysis is. This can be very important in more complicated cases where there were a lot of things that happened in the case that you discovered forensically. So especially in cases where you have discovered a complex set of actions that a user took in order to do something they weren't supposed to do. Sometimes this story-based method can be really useful because sometimes you have things that happen asynchronously in the case. Like nothing, not every case happens perfectly in chronological order. You sometimes have things that, you know, happen independently of each other, but are both pieces of information that are important to report on in the case. And so doing it chronologically doesn't make sense because there's no way to actually put them in order if things are happening simultaneously or asynchronously, separate from each other. So sometimes you have to lay the report out in a way that draws a picture for the reader. And within that picture, you are filling in the gaps with your forensic analysis to show how you know certain events took place. And you're structuring it in such a way that the user can follow along with the analysis based on a story that's being told, as opposed to this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. Right? In a story, you're trying to get the reader to come along with you with this investigative journey that you went on based on the forensics that you were conducting. And story-based also works really well if you are relying on contextual information for your analysis. So, for example, if you're doing forensic analysis on a computer and your analysis was aided through external documentation. So things like if the attorney provides you with other investigative documents that they have that you then rely on to do your forensic analysis. So for example, it could be something like let's say, oh, here's a work order document that shows some work was conducted on the target computer that you're doing analysis on. But you can then use that as, okay, cool, this work order says the following things happened on this computer. Let's look at the computer and then see if we can match those up and see if that provides some extra context for the analysis that we're doing. So that's one of those things where it's not really chronological. It's more, you've got this contextual story that you need to lay out for the reader that you did this analysis because you had this external information that you used to prompt the analysis, which then resulted in a certain finding. And then you have that just the facts report. This is one that I would use in situations where you don't really have a conclusion about anything. You're not like making some complicated finding about some complicated analysis. You're just simply stating the work that you did. This is what I would call the type of report you might generate when you just process image the film with Cellebrite and then exported a UFED reader report and then provided that report to the investigator or the litigator or whatever the case may be. In this case, you're just simply writing a report that just simply states the facts of what you did in the case so that it's easy for everybody to understand. Here's the breadth and depth of what we did. Didn't really do any full analysis or examination, just kind of collected, preserved the data, and made it presentable for someone to review. And here are the basics of that process. So that's more of a simple, almost like memoized type of report. So these are, in my opinion, there's probably more report styles here, and I don't necessarily say one of these is better than the other. This is much more contextual, and basically you guys get to choose, which ones are best suited to the case that you're working on. But there could be other styles of this. So if somebody has other thoughts on the types of narrative styles in a forensic report, I'm happy to listen to that. These are just the ones that I generally think of whenever I'm thinking about, whenever I write a new report, these are the things I'm thinking of, okay, what's the structure of this report going to be? So report structure and strategy, this is really more about the mechanics of the report itself, like how it should be, how you should create it and set it up. General rule of thumb, just keep it simple. Like, don't overcomplicate it. Generally, if it's okay to be complex at first, but then you should just be humble and recognize when you're being too complex and iterate and always try to simplify things if you can. The idea here again is this is a non-technical person, a non-forensic person ingesting your report. So the more complicated you make it, the harder it's going to be for them to get any value out of the report. Even if it means, you have a fairly simple summary that just quickly gets the reader the ultimate findings of what you're trying to convey. And then maybe later in the narrative, you go into much more detail so that you can balance that against what you need. Use moderately sized paragraphs. So this goes back to my signs of a bad report. Typically, you don't want paragraphs to be more than about 5 sentences. And you really want to be very judicious in how you structure paragraphs. You want to make sure there's lots of white space so the user can read a paragraph and be able to digest a complete thought. You don't want like a page worth of just text with no white space, no paragraph breaks, nothing. That's just going to make your reader, not want to read the report. And also it's just going to make it not effective. They're going to have a hard time reading all of that text and actually digesting it into some kind of thought pattern. Again, split the report up into sections, headers, subheaders, and titles. So take your analysis and try to break it up into general thoughts and ideas, and then split those up into headers and use titles in your report to split those sections up. Again, this just gives the reader a way to split up your report mentally and actually digest it appropriately. Create an executive summary if you can. So this doesn't always need, this depends on the report. The report's fairly simple. You may not need it, but I always encourage some kind of 1 to 2 page executive summary. And what this is this is just one of the first pages in the report where the idea is the reader should be able to read your summary and within a few minutes, basically be able to understand exactly what the report is about. And then the rest of the report after that is just detail. It's just going into the details of how you know these findings and that sort of thing. But the idea is you want to be able to deliver a report to someone like a prosecutor. They flip to the first page, and within like a minute or two, they can scan it, see your findings, get an idea of what it is that you're trying to convey. And then they know like, okay, cool. Now I know what this report is. I know what it's about. I can digest the details later and dig into it later. But now I've got enough to know what action I can take, like whether this report is actionable or not, or whether it's useful to me. That's the whole point. And I promise you, people you deliver reports to will love you if you have something like this, or you have a report where it has a nice executive summary where they can read it, digest what you're giving them, and they can make quick decisions based on the report that you provided. Use white space. So this just means, the more white space, the better. It just makes the report easier to digest, easier to read. Use sans serif fonts if you can. These are fonts that do not have, the sort of, if you look at Times New Roman, it has all these fancy serifs, which are called, the serifs are like the little extra flares that are on the letters. The problem with this on digital displays, which is what most people are going to read your report on, it adds a lot of textual noise to the screen. And so it can make it a lot harder for users to read the actual text. So use something that's a sans serif font, something that doesn't have those font flarings on them. This is just one of those things where it just makes the report a lot. Again, this helps add that white space concept to the report, makes it easier to read. So last couple of things, and then we'll jump into an example report that I'm going to show. An important thing here is in today's, in today's modern technology, we have these cool things called LLMs, these language models like OpenAI, Claude, Llama, all these really cool systems that are obviously, big cultural shifts in how we do work nowadays. Big question you probably all have, should we use LLMs in our report writing? My answer is absolutely. I think you should absolutely use these LLMs to your advantage if you're allowed to, but you should be very, very cautious with them. And what I mean by that is you should still be the writer report. Please do not use an LLM to just write the report for you. You want to still be the person commanding the thoughts and ideas and analysis that's going into the report, but you use the LLM as a writing assistant. And what that means is you start by writing a paragraph that completes a thought about some analysis or some concept you're trying to convey, and then use the LLM to help you clarify it. Use the LLM as an assistant to say, give it a paragraph and say, hey, is there a clearer way to rephrase this? Can you give me some examples of different ways I can state this idea? And something like Claude or OpenAI will give you different examples of of different ways that you can write that sentence or different ways you can write that paragraph. And it gives you another way to iterate on what you're writing. If you feel like you've written a paragraph or written a few paragraphs and you're not sure that you're really clearly getting the idea across, these LLMs can be extremely powerful in helping you rephrase and restate and rethink how you are approaching a concept. And this is also helpful if you feel you're not as strong in like grammatical issues, if your grammar isn't as good as you'd like it to, or if you feel like you need some help with vocabulary or things like that. This is where these LLMs can really help you as well, where you can ask it to, if you're having trouble figuring out how to state something, you can describe to an LLM, hey, I'm trying to talk about this issue. I'm trying to describe it in this kind of way. Can you help me describe it in the way that I'm trying to do it? And it will give you some examples on how to describe a concept. So this is how LLMs should be used in report writing, where it can be very useful. One of the things I've noticed when I've used LLMs with reporting and just documentation in general, is sometimes the LLM can be, I don't have an easy way to describe this, but it can sometimes just be too fancy and a little too cute. And it gives it kind of this soulless quality where it doesn't feel like it was written by a real person. So it's one of those things where if you've used LLMs enough and you've asked it to help you draft things, you'll see what I'm talking about, where it uses language that's a little too sophisticated, or it uses sentence structure that's a little too perfect. And it gives this very artificial feel to what's being written. So this is where I say be very, very cautious about using LLMs to write your entire report. You want to generally use it to help you craft and sort of refine ideas that you already have. And then I'd be very, very careful of asking it to refine something and just simply copying and pasting what it gives you. I would use it to help you generate ways of expressing ideas that you're trying to get across, and then use that for inspiration, then to rewrite what you already have. I'd be very careful of using the LLM to just straight up write stuff that you want it to write, because this is what will happen. And eventually we're going to get to a point where we all recognize when something's been written with an LLM, at least in today's current iteration of LLMs, because they just have a very specific style to them that's kind of easy to tell once you've read a lot of LLM based stuff. So that's how I would describe using I think LLMs are extremely powerful for report writing. But like I said, just with these caveats of use it as an assistant, as something to help you iterate, not something to actually write the report for you. So this next section, this is an example report structure that I'll run through really quick, and then I'll show you an example of this. Generally, the way I like to do my reports, I like to have a cover page, which is just a nice, page one item that just says, here's my organization, here's our logo, here's the name of the case or the matter or the project, here's the report date, and here's who wrote the report. Just a really nice, clean cover page. Makes the report look really professional. Again, table of contents. If the report is less than 5 pages, you can probably, not have the table of contents. But if it's more than like 5 pages, I would strongly encourage you adding this. Report summary. We talked about this already, but this should basically be the very first page of the report after the table of contents, where again, the reader should be able to read this and within a few minutes understand what the report is, what the findings are, and what kind of action they can take with the report. After the report summary, you then get into your detailed narrative and analysis. This is much more about your personal style and how you like to report things. This is where these concepts of chronological, story-based, and just the facts come into play. Because this detailed narrative analysis, this is where you're actually going to detail what your findings are and provide some evidence behind why you're saying the things that you're saying. And this goes into all the things I talked about earlier about don't be overcomplicated, just provide enough to where you can more or less back up what your findings are. I always encourage a strong usage of screenshots where possible. Reference external attachments or exhibits. So don't just, if you have that report export that's important for the case, reference it as an attachment. Use footnotes where it makes sense. So if you have a complicated term or something that is not going to be a colloquial term for any human on the street, add a footnote that just quickly explains what that term is. And just state the minimum you can to support your findings, right? This helps keep the report from being overly complex. After the basic narrative analysis, you then have optional sections where if there's some other information you want to illustrate that's not directly baked into your analysis, you can add these optional sections. So things like if you want to put a list of people involved in the case, or some forensic teams have like a glossary of terms. So just a standard glossary of 24 terms that just reference, okay, this is what this term means. This is what this term means. Or this is when I reference this procedure, this is what I'm talking about. Just something that helps the reader be able to reference things they may not have context for. You also have a conclusion here. So the conclusion, this can go before these optional sections. This can actually be a part of the narrative if you want. But generally, I found that conclusions in the report are generally redundant because basically your report summary is your conclusion. So if you have a report summary that's already outlining a summary of your findings, you really don't need a conclusion. It's just redundant at that point. So I would say if you really need a conclusion, if it's a regulatory thing, I guess add it, but it's really these days, I think it's redundant and really not necessary because I think this is one of those areas where, in my opinion, the conclusion should be the first thing in the report, not the last thing. So I personally think a conclusion is sort of an outdated concept that really doesn't, I don't think to me makes any sense. You can still add it if you want, but I would just say, use the report summary as your conclusion as opposed to an actual conclusion. And at the very end, attachments and exhibits. So this is where in the report, you can either straight up attach attachments to the report and just label them as exhibit A, B, C, or whatever convention you want to use. I would strongly advise if you're a forensic expert, if you have any chance of testifying, I would go ahead and attach your CV or resume. Just make this a standard part of your reporting process. Just makes it easier so that when people outside of your team get this report, they can just see who you are and see, okay, who is this person that's telling me all these things? Complicated things. Just makes it very easy to have that context. And then you can also reference digital exhibits. So things like UFED reports or external data sets. You can make references to those, but just make sure that they are, attached with the report, like as a zip file attachment or something like that. And then just reference them in the report so that when someone gets the report, they know, hey, this report, it requires the context of these attachments or exhibits. So if someone gets a copy of the report and they see that a UFED report is listed as an attachment, but they don't have it, then that lets them know that, oh, there's some data here I need to have access to so I can get the full context of the report. All right, so last thing here, documentation. This documentation is easy in my opinion because there's really no rules around it. Documentation is much more about you as the examiner and how you like to document your work. But this is where you can use whatever format you need, whatever method you need. The idea here is to document basically what you did and how you did it. And the main purpose of that is just so that you can reverse engineer your own work. You want to be able to take good enough documentation so that if you have to look back at your case 6 months later, you can go into your documentation and figure out all the work that you did and how you did it. This also makes your reporting a lot easier because what you can do is if you take good documentation, you can then take that documentation and distill it into your report. So sometimes in cases, you may not have to write an actual forensic report for like several months, if not years, after the work is done. In those cases, having good documentation just makes it really easy to go in and write your narrative, write your forensic narrative, because you have your documentation, you have your notes. If you have something like Monolith, you have all the case record data as well. So you have a lot of information to reference, just make it really easy to write out a solid report. I would encourage you if you're using if you're taking notes or documentation, you can use anything you want. I would say use something that has a rich text editor and something that supports screenshots at the very least. There's tons of note-taking tools out there. We have a free note-taking tool on our website that you can download and use. Monolith itself has a note-taking system built into it as well. But the point is you could use a Word document if you wanted for your note-taking. You can see here for the notes for this presentation, I'm just using a simple markdown editor, right? The point is use whatever works for you to document the work that you're doing so that it makes it easier for you to reverse engineer and report, your detailed findings to someone else. So reporting is the hard part. Documentation is the easy part. Some people are worried about discoverability in documentation. I've never worried about it. I think that's an overblown concern. I'm perfectly happy for someone to discover my notes if they want to. I'm not worried about anything related to that. If I were you, I wouldn't be worried about discoverability. Just take your notes as you need them. They're for you. They're yours to help you with, historical review of your analysis and help you with, basically your own work. So I would not limit that by worrying about whether someone in court gets to see your notes or not. And I think that's an overblown concern. So real quick, before I open the Q&A, I'm going to switch over to an example report really quick. And I'm going to also drop this in the chat so that you guys have copies of this stuff. You guys should be able to see this. This is a Word document. So this is an example that very closely matches even the forensic reports that Monolith produces. But this is an example that kind of distills some of the things I was talking about. So I have a nice cover page here. Again, it just states the organization, what this report is, the case number, case name, has the date, has the name of the person who wrote the report. Again, this is just an example. You can construct this cover page however you want. Here's a table of contents. This is a short report, so there's not much here to have in the table of contents, but this is using the Word table of contents, so it's clickable, it's navigable. It gives the user a really easy way to review and navigate the content of the report. And then down here, we have our case summary page. So in blue are just my notes in the report that just describe what each section is. The white parts are the actual content. So you can see here for the report summary, executive summary, we have a very short description of like, okay, here's what the report is about, and here's the main issues or findings that the reader should be concerned with. And so just from reading this alone, this section right here, within a couple of minutes, the reader should be able to get exactly what they need from the report without going any further. I always encourage also, because we're digital forensic analysts, I would encourage just a brief list of the evidence that this report is discussing, because this makes it easier for the reader to understand the context of, okay, cool, you have all this analysis, but what evidence did you look at to make these conclusions? And they can quickly be like, oh, there was a phone and there was a MacBook. Cool. Okay, that makes things very easy for them to understand. Here's the evidence we may need to present in court. Here's the evidence that I need to be aware of for this analysis. And then lastly, I add this section here that just a brief discussion of the forensic software used. Again, just a simple list. I would make it to where this should be the only place your forensic tools are mentioned. You don't want to go into too much detail about the forensic tooling and how you use them. You just want to briefly mention them just so that everybody understands the tech stack that you're using to do your analysis. And then down here, here's an example of the narrative analysis. Again, ignore the blue sections. These are just my comments on how the report should be outlined. But basically, you can see here, I've got headings here. Here's main finding one. Got discussion paragraphs. I have a screenshot here with a screenshot caption so that readers can understand what the screenshot is, what its use case is. Main finding two, main finding three. And again, this is opinionated, so you can change this based on what your needs are. This is just a very basic structure just to emphasize things like paragraph size, white space, titles and headings, screenshots, screenshot captions, short digestible sections. That some of these sections, they may just be one paragraph long. They may be 6 paragraphs long. They may have subheadings and subtitles. But the idea is you should be able to go through a report and just quickly jump from one section to the next and be able to digest individual complete thoughts so that the reader has a way of actually ingesting and navigating through your report. And then down here, we just have an exhibits section where we reference external attachments or exhibits that go along with the report to provide the additional context. So that completes my presentation for today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the Q&A section and see if anybody has any questions. So I'll let Megan kind of take over that part of it. And while she's doing that, I'm going to drop these documents into the chat so you guys have access to them.
Alrighty. Thanks, everyone. So for Q&A, if you would like to join us on stage and ask your question live, go ahead and click the raise hand button. And I'll give you permissions to go ahead and ask your question live. We have had a couple questions come in from the chat and the Q&A tab. If you're more comfortable putting your question in the Q&A tab, go ahead and drop it there as well. Also, hey, Ron. I'll get started with some that we've had come in the chat and the Q&A. First question we have is from Tom. Do you think device details, serial number, IMEI, etc., are important in the report if they don't play a part in a particular issue?
If the evidence doesn't play a particular issue, I don't know. I would say that the serial number is important just because when you're in the report, when you go through, like, here's the list of evidence that that make up the findings in this report, you want some kind of unique identifier so that people can basically universally get know what evidence item, what physical device in the universe they're referencing. So I do think some kind of serial number or at least a unique identifier for the item is important. Whether it's, now the other question is, if the evidence is actually being used as a reference in the report, this just depends, because you could, let's say you looked at some evidence and you just had no findings. You can still reference the evidence and just put a disclaimer as part of your executive summary, no findings related to this item. If that's even the case. So I do think the serial number is important to reference, just but in the sense that there should be a unique identifier of some kind for all the evidence that you list, just so that everybody can reference it globally, as opposed to if you just have like just the evidence number by itself, that may not be good enough. But at least some kind of unique identifier for the item, just so that when things start getting passed around and people are referencing items, we all have some universal identifier to reference when we're talking about things.
All right, awesome. Our next question is from Ron. Should reports be written for printing or for reading on a computer? Printing would mean foregoing hyperlinks or other content that is not supported when printed, but he's found that attorneys like print for use in court.
I would say for me, um, I would write the reports for screen reading, at least in my view, because they do print those out for like court because I think most courts don't really have a digital register. But once you get into like federal stuff, they have Pacer, and most of your stuff gets uploaded to Pacer and becomes like digital document anyway. So in my experience, at least in my experience, maybe if your experience is most of your stuff gets printed out and manually reviewed, then you should, you know, adjust your reports for that use case. But in my experience, most of my reports are always digital. They're always PDF'd and uploaded to some kind of digital management system that the attorneys use, or the attorneys are sharing my report through email left and right. So my experience has always been, my reports are 99% of the time are reviewed on screen, like in a computer. But again, if your reports are mostly being reviewed in print, like physical, then maybe you should adjust your reporting style to that. Which is where I think typically Times New Roman is the font that's used for print specifically. I don't know exactly why, but that's what it is used. But if you know your reports in digital format, I would strongly use something like sans serif when possible.
Okay, cool. Matt, just a quick aside for you. I think when you're dropping the files, you may have to select sending the chat to everyone so that everybody in the chat sees it.
Good idea. Good call. All right.
All right. And then while you're doing that, these next questions are from Garrett. Um, they do a lot of internal scheduling around search warrants and case milestones, and today they're using Outlook calendars and shared spreadsheets to coordinate that. He's wondering if Monolith is planning any scheduling functionality or integrations with something like Outlook Exchange, calendar feeds, task deadline views, so case dates and assignments can live in Monolith instead of being split across systems.
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is we're looking into it. We don't have any specific plans right now because we're still trying to figure out the best way to do it. There's a couple of ideas that we have. One is to integrate with other calendar systems that already exist. So like for our team internally at Monolith, we use a system called SavvyCal, which is a calendar scheduling system. And basically you create an account with SavvyCal, you list like the available appointment times, like the range of dates that things are available, people are available to make appointments, and then they pick an appointment they want to use. And that keeps track of like availability, and you can basically synchronize your calendar into a system like SavvyCal, and it automatically blocks off times that are not available. So most likely we'll probably go in a direction like that because we could build our own calendar system and all that stuff, but it's very, very difficult to engineer a system where we have a calendar that also integrates with all of your team's calendars and then can appropriately synchronize things and still manage things like availability of time for drop off and pickup, availability based on who's in the office, who's out of the office, availability based on other scheduled things. So there's a lot of work. That's basically a product unto itself. So I think the approach that we've leaned toward is like, let's see if we can integrate with things like Calendly or things like SavvyCal, where you guys have that account. And this could also work with Outlook Calendar. So if you guys are using Outlook to manage the stuff already, and Outlook has a mechanism through which a user can schedule time on your Outlook calendar, then maybe that's something we can integrate too. But the idea would be find a way to integrate with these systems that already exist that we can just sort of link Monolith into so that the user can easily piggyback off of Monolith to use that system to then schedule things. So that we've talked about internally, and we're still researching to figure out the best way to integrate Monolith with a system like that, as opposed to like trying to build it ourselves. So the idea would be like Monolith would then have a link where you could then view things and see like the calendar and see things that are scheduled and that sort of thing. But it's actually pretty complicated, and we're still working on trying to figure it out.
All right, cool. This next question is also from Garrett. He had a question about relay. Once a request is accepted and converted into a monolith case, the requester primarily sees progress updates, but later changes on the lab side, like additional evidence being added to the case, are not reflected back in relay. Is there a plan or roadmap item to make relay mirror more of the case lifecycle, such
Yeah.
as newly added evidence, so the end user has a more complete view?
Yeah, this is another thing we recently discussed. The issue there is if you think about what Relay is a request system. So the user makes a request, let's say for like one item, like a smartphone. And then in Monolith is a case management system. So you've got an entire case where just one of those evidence items um, may be related to one, multiple requests. So the issue that we've come to is like, okay, well, how much we could create a new interface in Relay where the user could see a pared down version of like the case information. So they have the request that they submit, and the request has just the information that they submitted in the request. Then maybe we build another view where there's sort of like a case view where they can then go into the full case that that request is associated with and then see more information. The problem we've run into with that idea, not a problem, but just the conundrum we've run into is like, well, okay, so are we just replicating Monolith features inside of Relay? At one point, do we just say, well, just make them a guest in Monolith and let them just look at the case in Monolith and see everything that's going on? And that's the piece that we're trying to figure out is how do we bridge that gap without just replicating all the stuff in Relay that we already have in Monolith? Um, because the purpose of Relay is to say you have a requester, they made a request for one piece of evidence, so that's the evidence we're going to show them. If there are other evidence items in the case, we need to find a way to, let's say you guys add more evidence to that case independently outside the requester. We need to find a way to let that user see those evidence items as well in Relay in terms of reviewing their status. And that's where we're trying to figure out how to close those gaps without just replicating all the features we have in Monolith inside of Relay. So maybe that will lead us down the path of maybe we should have guest users in Monolith where you can add a guest user and they just have read-only access to a specific case, and then they just see all the data in that case. Or maybe we do something where we create a case, some kind of case view in Relay where they're seeing more case information about all the evidence, but it's just a much more narrow view than what you have in Monolith. There's that stuff that we're trying to figure out what that workflow should be and what it should look like. And it's a good question because it's a problem that we're actively discussing and trying to figure out.
All right, next question we have is from Jennifer, switching gears back to reporting. If you need to represent information in a timeline format, how do you generally do that? In a document, a table, something else?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the timeline. If it's a large timeline, the problem that you have with it is the type of report that you're going to deliver is like a PDF or a Word document that's in the standard 8.5 by 11 format, right? So what you run into with timeline formats is that usually you don't have enough horizontal space to display the timeline in a grid or a table. So that's where it can get kind of tricky, where depending on the timeline and how much information. So if you have a timeline that's just two columns, for example, or you have the timestamp and then a description of the event, that's probably something you could probably put right into the report. And if you think, and then depending on how many timeline entries you have, you might want to decide like where that should live in the report. Should that be at the end in the exhibits section? Should it be a separate attachment? Does it make sense to have it embedded directly into the report? It's not really about like the problem with that is not really about like should you have the timeline. It's more about like where do you actually put it in the report, and it really depends on how big the timeline is, how much detail the timeline has. So if you have like a forensic timeline, for example, that might be like a whole spreadsheet that has a dozen columns in it with all kinds of information. And that's where you need to probably attach that as an exhibit that the user can basically look at as a reference with the report, as opposed to being embedded in the report itself. If it's a very simple timeline where you're just showing it more of an investigative timeline where you have a timestamp and then you have a mess and an event description that says person A did blah, 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 blah. And then the next line is timestamp this person B did blah, 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 blah. That's one that you can probably put and just embed it directly in the report and have it be a part of your narrative where you say, have a section where you have timeline of events, right? Where you've got your analysis, you go through and you highlight the significant events that you care about, and then maybe at the end you have a section in your analysis called timeline of events, and then you just have a very simple, fairly narrow table that has something like timestamp and event description, where a reader can just chronologically go through all the events that you think are important for them to see. But it's really one of those. It really just it's all based on the breadth and depth of that timeline and how much information it has, and you kind of have to decide for yourself. I would say if it has more than three columns, and more than three columns, and maybe more than 50 events, I would just put it in its own exhibit and attach it, and then reference it throughout your report, and then maybe highlight out of those events the significant events that you actually care about and want to report on, and then let the user ingest and read through the full timeline event list separately as an attached exhibit. But that's really more art than science. It's really kind of just use your best judgment on how you want to report on it, and then make a decision. I wouldn't necessarily make it a standard part of your reporting process. Just figure out per case like what makes sense.
Okay, let's see what we got next. Next we got a question from Dan. He recalls hearing about the Monolith mobile app in beta, and he's wondering what the timeline for the release for that might be.
It's a great question. It's available now, so if you want to use it, we can send you a link to download it. It's available on the Android store right now. It's live on the Google Play Store, so you can download it right now for Android. Just Google us in the Play Store. iOS, I'm still wrestling with Apple on getting the app, all the stuff that it needs to do the full release, but it's available. The full app is available in beta, where the Apple has this beta store called Test Flight. You install Test Flight, we send you the invite link, um, and then once we give you the link, you can then install Test Flight and download Monolith through the Test Flight app. I'm trying real hard to get this thing through iOS's standards. It's just literally I've submitted it like a dozen times, and every time they come back with me with like little nitpicky things that I have to fix in the app. It's stupid stuff like configuration details and like certain notifications the user needs to have in the app. It has nothing to do with like the application itself. It's just all these configuration things that I feel like I'm playing a little bit of a shell game with them, where I keep submitting it, I fix it, and they tell me something else to fix. So it's just kind of an ongoing process. But I'm really trying hard to get it fully available. But if you want it, you can have access to it right now. The link that Andrew just shared in the chat, you can use that link and get access to the app right now if you want, on iOS specifically.
All right, and then the last question we have here is from Gunner. He's wondering if you've heard of California's new SB 524 bill, which apparently requires departments to publicly disclose when AI tools are used to write or assist in writing reports. So they have specific text they have to put in there if it's used AI. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's fine. I think, yeah, if that's the requirement, and if you use, and it's up to you. If you don't like that requirement, then don't use AI, right? Don't use it. If you don't care and you still want to use AI, I would say come up with whatever that reporting requirement is. Come up with standard language that describes how you're using AI, and then just make that a standard disclaimer in your reports. And I would just be. This is one of those things too, where it's like, oh, if I testify, they're going to ask me if I wrote it or if AI wrote it. Well, the problem is when you testify, your report is just there as like your report isn't testifying in court. You are, right? So if you get asked, well, how do we know? Like, did AI write this report? You can say, no, I wrote it. I used AI to help me clarify and clean up some of the language, but my report isn't the one testifying. I'm the one testifying. So stuff like that, I think some of us get a little too concerned about what's going to happen in court and how it's going to look. I don't, because this is also goes into like, this is the same argument you could make about how you're using your forensic tools. Because if you think about it, okay, you used AI for XYZ thing. Well, you're also using forensic tools that you have literally no idea how they're working, but we're all relying on them to do things for us, right? And so this is why earlier when I was discussing, really you just want to reference the forensic tools you used like once, and then really don't mention them again. Because the more you mention those forensic tools, the more you're implying that you're fully reliant on those tools to do the work, and that you have a hard time describing the forensics without referencing some pre-engineered forensic platform to help you do the work. Same thing with AI, right? It's just another tool in the toolbox. You use it to do what you need, but you don't. If you have your entire report written by an AI, then I would say you deserve to be skewered on the stand, right? Like that's no different than if you just use Celebrite to do literally everything and didn't take any time to actually understand what you were putting in your report. You just regurgitated whatever you saw in Celebrate. Right at that point, you deserve to get grilled on the stand in that case. With AI, use it diligently for your needs. Don't use it to do all your work for you. You use it as an assistant. You use it to help you do your work better. And that's how you describe it. And then just come up with some good language on that disclosure on that accurately describes how you're using AI. You use AI to assist in your, and again, I don't want to do this off the cuff because I haven't thought about it. It's a good question. I would say maybe talk to your leadership, um, if you're in law enforcement, talk to your prosecutors about, have a discussion with them about what it means. And it's also possible maybe a lot of agencies could even ban the use of AI because they don't want criminal justice information to be populated into these LLMs, right? So there's a lot of rules there that you have to kind of think through. But I would say don't be shy, don't be afraid to use AI, don't be afraid to say that you've used it. Just be prepared to explain how you've used it and use it in a practical, ethical way that makes sense, that makes you look good, right? You can spin the use of AI to say, no, I want to effectively report on my findings, and I used AI to help me effectively report on it. Because we're not Ernest Hemingway, right? We're not the greatest writers in history. So we all need a little help with our report writing, and AIs are very powerful tools to help us do it. And I think we should absolutely leverage that to our advantage and just come up with a way to accurately explain how we're using it so that people are comfortable with it.
All right, fantastic. It looks like that is it for questions.
Um, Chris Feaster, you're asking if there's a redeem code for TestFlight. Yeah, if you check a few comments above you, there's a link there for TestFlight. That's our link for the for beta access to the mobile app. You should be able to use that link on your phone, and it should give you access to the application. Just email us. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, if anybody else has trouble getting the mobile app, just email us at support@modelforensics, and then we'll give you help. So Dan Peterson made a good comment here. Their county attorney doesn't allow AI written reports, specifically Axon AI reports, but I have used it for simple report formatting. It was all my info, but put the report into a nice format. Yeah, exactly. So you just use the LLM to help you with, not like content. You're just using it to help you shape your report and help you refine ideas that you already have. You're just helping you basically get these ideas across in a more, uh, you know, you're you, helping you take these really complex topics and put them in a format that makes it really easy for non-technical people to ingest and read. That's what we're using AI for here. Yes, the recording will be shared. I think Megan is going to email everybody a link afterwards
Yep, that
with the
is
recording.
correct.
And then after a while, we're just going to post it on our YouTube channel to be available for the public as well. Cool. All
Oh,
right.
sorry, I was doing some chat housekeeping. All right.
Anything? I think we're all good on questions unless you see anything else, Megan.
Nope, I think we've got it covered. Thanks everybody for taking the time to attend today. Um, we will be doing these, as Matt said, every 2 weeks on Wednesdays, so keep an eye on our LinkedIn page to see when the next one is and what that topic will be. Looking
Cool.
forward to doing the next one.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending. I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.